This video is going to give you a brief introduction to population biology, so be sure to take notes. First of all, let's talk about levels of organization. We can start off with the lowest level, which is really like the individual, but we'll think of individuals as species. And if you remember just from a couple days ago, a species is any organism of the same kind that can naturally reproduce and produce fertile offspring. So if two organisms reproduce and do not produce fertile offspring, they are members of different species. So here we have a frog, green tree frog, so we're going to consider that an individual of one species. Then, when we get a whole bunch of members of the same species living in the same area at the same time, so they are interbreeding, they're interacting with one another, that's a population. So we have our green tree frog, and he has some green tree frog friends. They're all the same species, so this makes up one population. Then we can move up a level to the community. In a community, we have all of the living organisms in the same area at the same time. Again, they're existing in the same space and time, so they can interact with one another. So we have our population of green tree frogs, and then maybe we add some grass, a fly, a robin with a worm, a squirrel. So all of these things make up the community. Next, we can add in we have the community, which are living things, and we use the term biotic for living components of an ecosystem. And then we're going to add in the physical environment or the non-living aspects of the ecosystem. These, the biotic and abiotic aspects are interacting with one another, and that makes up the ecosystem. So we have our community here, and then we're also going to include things like the climate, maybe water, minerals, sunlight, rocks, all these non-living components of the environment. So here I have a river, sun, and the energy role of an organism in an ecosystem we'll be talking about more over the next couple of days, but it's really determined by how individuals obtain energy and how they interact with other living organisms and the ecosystem. So this interaction piece is really important. So we're going to focus mostly on population size right now. The population size, or the size of a population, is really a tug of war between biotic potential and environmental resistance. So the biotic potential of an ecosystem is basically if we have ideal conditions, meaning there's no restraints on population growth, it's how fast the population can grow. So if there's unlimited food, if there's unlimited space, there's unlimited water, how fast can that population grow? And then in real ecosystems, there usually are things that are going to slow down population growth or restrict population growth. So that's environmental resistance, and those are things that provide limits to population growth. So maybe they do run out of food, or maybe there's just not enough space for as many individuals. So the environmental resistance we can think of as these arrows here, slowing down the growth from that biotic potential. So we will talk about population growth a lot, and we can use little r, which is the population growth rate, and that's going to be determined by the mortality or death rate, so how many individuals are dying per population size, and then also natality or birth rate, little b, how many births are there per population size. Obviously, birth rate is going to be positive and death rate is going to be negative. So if we take the birth rate minus the death rate, that gives us our population growth rate, or little r. For many ecosystems, we also need to consider movement between ecosystems or movement between populations. So when we have immigration, that's when organisms are moving into the population. And emigration is when organisms are moving out of the population. So immigration is also going to be positive, emigration is negative. We see a couple patterns in the way populations grow. So some species are fast growth species are also considered R-selected species. These types of species tend to have a ton of offspring in a very short time period. So something like insects are a great example. These tend to occur when conditions are unpredictable and change rapidly, so that they can make use of environmental or times in the environment when things are really good, when there's a rainstorm and everything's in bloom, for instance. These organisms tend to have very small bodies, give very little parental care. So imagine a fish that lays 10,000 eggs. That fish isn't going to tend to every single little fish that hatches. They probably are just going to swim off and make them fend for themselves. Now the opposite of that, we consider slow growth and reproduction, or K-selected. These organisms tend to be larger, they mature later. So something like an elephant would be a great K-selected species. They're going to occur in more stable environments because it takes a long time for them to raise their offspring. It's important that they have resources for their offspring reliably, I guess. They also give a lot of parental care to their offspring, so they're only going to have small numbers of offspring at a time. Hippos are another great example. Humans, of course, are as well. So population growth, the way that populations can grow, if we graph the number of individuals per time, there are a couple different patterns we'll see. Now, linear growth is what we're seeing here, where we add the same number of individuals each time period. So if we have a bunch of swallows and we add 5 swallows a year, that would be linear growth. Now, this doesn't occur very often in nature. It's more common with things like money. So if we're putting money into a savings account, and let's say we put $100 into the savings account every month, it's just going to grow by $100 every month. Now, types of population growth that are more common in nature, one is exponential growth, and this is where the population is growing by a fixed percent each time period. So for example, the population might grow by 10% every year. So if the population starts off with 1,000 individuals, the next year we add 10% of 1,000, so we'll get 1,100 individuals. Now for the next year, we're going to add 10% of 1,100, so we actually have to add 110 individuals. So then we end up with 1,210 individuals. The next year, we're going to add 121 individuals. So you can see that every year we're adding more and more individuals to the population. So the population might start off growing relatively slowly, but then as the population gets bigger, it grows really, really quickly. Now, populations can't grow exponentially forever. They're gonna run out of resources. So what ends up usually happening is a type of growth called logistic growth. Exponential growth we call a J-curve because it looks like a J. Logistic growth we call an S-curve because if you look at that graph there, it looks like an S. Here it starts off with exponential growth. So if we look at this graph and just look at it up to about this point, it makes a J, so that's exponential growth. But then the growth actually slows down and levels off. So growth stops. And that's due to some sort of environmental resistance stopping that growth from going on exponentially forever. That number, the population size, where the population levels off, we call the carrying capacity. And that is it for now.